that was a very brief period of time when Newton, Laplace, and all these other, ancients thought we're almost there. And they made a specific prediction, which was, in the future, we'll know more. And when we know more, we won't need God. And I don't need God to explain why it rains some days and doesn't rain another day. It's just not, I'm not a farmer. Maybe people did. But I need God to explain lots of things in my life. And I don't think we've become any closer today than we were 1,000 years ago at making sense of them or having some easy explanation where I can make sense. Why did this person die? Why did this person survive? Why do I feel this way? Why do people treat me that way, or whatever else? So once that's the case, you have to have another explanation. If you can't explain it with math, what can you explain it with?
Welcome to the More Than Sunday podcast, where we're tackling tough questions about our faith that many people have, but some are afraid to ask. I'm Rohini Drake, and I'm on staff here at First United Methodist Church Richardson, and each week I'm joined by two guests who will share their unique perspectives on some of these tough questions. Now, if you've listened to the previous 4 seasons of the More Than Sunday podcast, we're excited that in this season, we've added a few new features. We've added some coffee mugs, some couches, and cameras. So now, in addition to being able to listen to this podcast on your favorite podcast player, you can now watch it on our FUMCR YouTube channel. Today, we're jumping into the question, can Christians believe in science? And I'm so grateful to be joined by Dr. Michael Kilgard, who is a researcher and professor at UTD, and also an FUMCR church member, and also by Eric Czechowski. Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Michael, for being here today. And so you've been, it really is a welcome back to you, Michael, because you have been on a previous episode of this podcast.
One of our few returning guests, I should say. Yeah,
quite an honor
to
have you back.
It's good to be here.
That's how good your first episode was. We knew that we needed a follow-up. But for those that may not have heard that episode, could you give us just like a brief rundown of maybe what your current interests or research is in right now?
Sure. So I'm a professor at the University of Texas at Dallas, and I work on the brain. We're currently working on new treatments for people with stroke, spinal cord injury, and post-traumatic stress disorder. But really, we're interested in how the brain is rewired when it learns new things. So,
Michael, I'm so excited to continue in conversation with you. I remember in our last episode, which I think was in season 3, we had just a little bit of discussion towards the end of the episode about sort of the relationship between faith and science and the ways that we see miracles manifest in the world, and maybe how that can be related or is related to science. And then even after the episode, we were joking with you and saying, we need to unpack that a little bit more, maybe in the future. So again, really excited to be able to do that today. So in your role as a neuroscientist, I mean, how do you reconcile areas of faith, biblical truths that you see in the world with your faith?
Yeah. I mean, for me, the ability to tolerate things that I don't understand are vast. Every day I have to deal with people whose injuries I don't know how to work on. I don't understand them. And so in neuroscience, we're constantly surrounded with issues we barely understand. And that actually makes my faith familiar. The idea that I can question what I'm doing here at FUMCR, but in my professional life is just familiar. I think a lot of people don't want to tolerate as much uncertainty as I tolerate on a daily basis. But the idea that something isn't locked down and definitive and explainable is very comfortable for me. When someone has schizophrenia or autism or Alzheimer's, we have relatively little understanding. And so by comparison, even some of the miraculous events of the Bible don't seem nearly so daunting to me. They're relatively easy to explain in a larger context.
Yeah. I love hearing that sometimes the mystery is okay, that the things that are difficult to explain are things that we can even find comfort in some respects. My own faith journey, I grew up in a household that was not necessarily church-going most of the time. My dad is a scientist, 2 degrees in geology, and very analytical, and a lot of that kind of rubbed off on me as well. And so this sort of conversation between with the relationship between faith and science has always been intriguing to me. And growing up in that household, I always had a lot of those questions. Mm-hmm. And for me, one of the foundational readings of sort of my own faith journey was a Lee Strobel book called The Case for Faith. And Lee was formerly an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune and Yale Law School educated and really intelligent intellectual guy who actually was a self-proclaimed atheist for a long time, and took a journalistic dive into why people believe in God, why people believe in Christ, and how that manifests in the world. And reading through that book, I feel like has a lot of parallels to this sort of conversation, because he took a very scientific, a very journalistic approach to actually aiming to disprove the existence of God, and yet through that process found that there were more truths that came alive out of the Bible and out of Scripture that he became a believer. So that was a foundational thing for me, and again, comforting to hear that you've maybe had some similar experiences in your journey.
Yeah, no, very similar. My father was a physics major and certainly very analytical in all of these things. But also, a man of faith. And he would always talk about in the Episcopal Church, the middle way. And he would always say things like, there are many versions of the truth. Just different people experience the same situation in different ways. And that general mindset made it easier for me to tolerate, again, these different uncertainties. One person believes this, one person believes that. Where they are in their faith journey, where they are geographically, all of those things to me wasn't really such a crisis. When I went to high school, I went to a Catholic school, a Jesuit school down in Houston, and we studied theology just as a class. You'd go to chemistry and you'd go through it, and you'd go to, Old Testament, New Testament, morality, whatever it was. And it just was so incredibly useful. And I remember thinking the chemistry didn't make all that much more sense than anything that I was really learning in my theology classes, whether it was from a priest or a lay person. And that was helpful to put it into context. I think there's the sense when you're not currently sitting in a chemistry class that it all makes a lot of sense, that it's all very rigid and straightforward. There are no questions remaining. And most people, my daughter is currently in a chemistry and biology class, and she says there's lots of questions about how exactly things work. And so for me, that ability to view it as something to be studied, to be learned about, something that you can talk about, questions that you have, was helpful. As I became a scientist, all those questions from high school just got worse. I mean, they didn't get better. It wasn't that you spent more time learning about it and suddenly they all fell away and everything was easy. It was more and more complicated to reconcile all the things we know about the natural world. They got really confusing. And so to me, the idea that religion is complicated, confusing, mysterious in a way that is more so than science, I just don't see that. They seem very similarly daunting, miraculous, amazing, exciting. And so the conflict for me in my upbringing was pretty straightforward. The last piece for me was always, formerly you mentioned that word, the idea that Jesus is the truth. I just continue to believe that he is, and that means whatever I discover is the truth is getting closer to him. And so that makes it, I never worry about that. I remember one time early on in my scientific career, my mother was worried we were moving a gene from a worm to a fly to study some aspects of its function. And my mom asked me, do you think God wanted that gene moved from that animal to that other animal? Oh my God, I never thought about that. And so I went and did some digging. Of course, this stuff happens all the time. There's lots of human genes that came from bacteria. Things got swapped around. Apparently he does. Apparently that's a thing that he gave me the ability to move, and I'm not fighting with God in any way. And lots of my friends will argue maybe a more fundamentalist persuasion that do I have a problem with Jesus? And I always just say, me and I don't have any problems. That's just not a problem for me. And they typically aren't that curious about the details of why, but they're happy generally, which is, I think, comforting to them.
That is really interesting. And I do feel comforting to hear, like as a scientist, as a researcher, with a PhD, that you found a way to accept and live into the mystery. I know for me as a Christian, thinking about kind of like a thread that runs through my faith is transformation. Like there's transformations in my personal life and lives of people that I see that are connected to the church and to God. And then even in the Bible, we see lots of stories of physical and spiritual transformation. And one thing that really stood out to me in your first episode was that you mentioned that there are measurable physical changes that people can experience. that are tied to some biblical truths that can be studied and proven to be helpful. And I remember it vividly because Eric said, oh man, that's a whole nother episode.
We got to do this again.
So I'm kind of wondering, what are some of those examples that you have seen or are currently seeing that kind of not prove, but like help to support?
There are so many. It's sort of hard to choose a few. I always say, scientists goes to all this trouble. We spend billions of dollars, and often we eventually come up with that stuff that your grandmother said is really right. Whether that's about how to treat people or how to eat or whatever, you think you guys had to go work that hard to figure out that Pop-Tarts are not good for you or whatever it is. So many times it's this reality that we had to work so hard to find something so simple, and in particular about transformations, about where our lives are going to go. Students are constantly asking me, what is my future like? And I'm constantly, I don't know. When you mention transformation, the first thing that popped in my mind, which is something that a neuroscientist would think and maybe is a little unusual, is that things are not linear. People have heard that word linear. Of course, for us, that's a whole mathematical thing going on. But at every level, there's all these transition states that are flipping from one place to another. I was at a lunch meeting earlier this week with a mathematician sitting next to me, and he was saying, we're doing pretty good so long as there's only 3 things interacting. And of course, in your brain or in your social setting, it's hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, millions. And so the idea that there's room to change is really very clear. A lot of the faith traditions embrace science, I think now most. The Dalai Lama, for example, is famously interested in the brain and how meditation changes the brain. And he was not surprised when people went and said, let's compare you in these different states, look at people who've been trained for years versus people who've just picked it up and seen differences that are measurable, reliable, and consistent with the basic idea that meditation, prayer, reflection is helpful to us as humans. And I think that's consistent. And the idea that we'd be growing into consistency and not into fighting, that science would be a source of people coming together and not arguing about who's right about this, that or the other, to me is comforting. Things are coming together. That's how science is supposed to work. At a personal level, it's particularly challenging. I mean, a transformation can be a really positive one, but there's lots of really negative transformations. So 2 people experience the exact same event, and they have very, very different outcomes in their lives. How they process it, how they think about it, can be really different. One of the conditions I work on is tinnitus, ringing of the ears. It drives some people absolutely insane. In some parts of the world, people view it as, I now hear the sounds of the cosmos. And they feel at ease with it. It's just not something that bothers them because they've got a perspective that makes some sense. People who have experienced a traumatic event, we've got war in Europe at the moment, different people will be affected differently. Some people will experience very similar things and have different outcomes. And we can begin to understand that, but we're not in 2022 sitting here saying, here's why, here's the gene you've got, here's what you did wrong, anything like that. And more often than not, it really is the attitude, the faith, your social reactions, your relationship, your understanding of the world that help dictate that more so than some molecule or gene or chemical in your brain.
So, Michael, you talked about the fact that science and faith have generally been cohesive for you all through your life. Have there ever been times or any specific time where you felt like either a scientific discovery was difficult to reconcile with your faith, or that you had to choose your faith over science in any particular scenario?
That's a great question. It was so long ago that I have to really dig in it. It was really when I was first beginning to learn about science, and we learned about the notion that science can explain everything. That was something we were taught in school. And we specifically learned about this idea of a clockwork universe where if you knew the state of things, you could just play it all backward and learn what everything that happened before it. And if you knew the state of now and all the rules, you could predict all the future. Everything would make sense entirely. We were learning that in high school. That was already hundreds of years out of date. Kids are still taught that today, that there's this simple way with billiard balls that you can look back and see here how they all bounce together. And the reason you can blame it on Newton. Newton said, we can explain these amazing things. All of these things spinning around can all be explained. You can go backward thousands of years, millions of years. Go forward, you can predict when our galaxy is going to hit the Andromeda galaxy and exactly how many stars are going to collide zero, and things like that that are amazing. But the reality is those rules of physics pretty much only apply to things spinning around in a vacuum. Anything that has any kind of interesting interaction, as soon as you get beyond 3, you can't explain anything. And so that was a very brief period of time when Newton, Laplace, and all these other ancients thought we're almost there. And they made a specific prediction, which was, in the future, we'll know more. And when we know more, we won't need God. And I don't need God to explain why it rains some days and doesn't rain another day. That's just not, I'm not a farmer. Maybe people did. But I need God to explain lots of things in my life. And I don't think we've become any closer today than we were 1,000 years ago at making sense of them or having some easy explanation where I can make sense. Why did this person die? Why did this person survive? Why do I feel this way? Why do people treat me that way, or whatever else? So I think now that we've entered this new age, which is, again, some time ago, of quantum mechanics, you guys probably where are these ideas? Things are buzzing around, and it's all very probabilistic, very uncertain. It's not the case that there's this universe we could just run back, that everything is determined by our genes, determined by every molecule wiggling in some special way. And so once that's the case, you have to have another explanation. If you can't explain it with math, what can you explain it with? And of course, we have a beautiful creation story and explanation that makes sense to me, seems to make sense to you guys. And some people struggle with that. That's okay. You don't have to. You can go look at Clockwork Universe and see if that makes any sense to you, see if that's useful. More recently, it's become almost a comic book. We've switched from the Clockwork Universe to the multiverse. People watching Marvel comics will famously know about this. And the idea is that every time any atom strikes or moves in any way, an entire new universe is created. Maybe that's how it works. It seems very unlikely to me. It seems very, maybe that's how it is. And then I just happen to be in this one. There's gazillions of me just over the last 2 minutes. Every molecule of my finger wiggling is making a new universe. That seems so unlikely. So in the same way that faith to some people seemed kind of naive in the time of Newton, this seems so much better. This is going to replace it. We get to look back and think, it doesn't look so naive now. The current theories don't seem to explain very much at all. And our current understanding seems very consistent with the ideas that there's big stuff happening out there. There's big creations. There's big winds blowing. There's lots of things we don't understand, forces that we can understand better, but that we really can't understand fully. And that relies upon faith. If we're working with other scientists, we have to have faith in the other scientists. We got to believe what they told us. No one can understand it all. And I think that's true of the Bible. You can read it, but by the time you read it, you forgot what the first page was. You got to go back and do it again. And so a lot of aspects, of my life are like that. So I don't see a conflict particularly.
It's really great. I think that feels very comforting, again, just to know that we haven't gotten so far into what knowledge has taught us that we're done with God. Like, God is still here. God is still with us, and we can, just like 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it's the same for us now. And I do feel a comfort in knowing that.
That brings up an interesting question, Rohini, that I have. How would you describe the difference maybe between knowledge and wisdom?
My problem is not so much with wisdom. I feel pretty good about it. It's really knowledge that I have a problem with. We just don't have that much of it. And we often find out that the ideas we held were just crazy and wrong. It took a long time. My dad's generation was raised before we knew that the continents moved. Mm-hmm. And we just didn't know that. And people noticed that like Africa and South America kind of fit together, and they just laughed at those people. That's so crazy. That's so ridiculous that those things moved across an ocean. And then in the span of, less than a lifetime, it's obvious. Everybody knows there was a giant amalgamation of all the continents, and they split apart. And so we know a lot of things about rocks. I think you mentioned chemistry and some other things, geology. But we didn't know that at the speed of your fingernail growing, all the continents are moving around. And now it all makes sense. Why Florida is like that. It's like this piece of taffy pulled off the continent of the United States, and it's a piece of Africa left over. It all makes sense now, but it didn't make sense then. And people were making up all kinds of the craziest things. So it's more commonly that I have problems with the knowledge that I have, so-called knowledge, because the wisdom traditions typically don't change that much. They typically say very similar things that they've said for long periods of time, which saves me an enormous amount of time. I know I work with kids who are struggling to find out where I'm going to be, how I'm going to do, and they're trying to figure it out themselves. And there's a lot of that. Just figure it out yourself. You do you, I'll do me. Really? You think 75 years is enough time? I don't think that's enough time. It hasn't been enough time for me. But starting with a leg up from my family, from my church, of intellectual basis, whether it's Laplace and Newton or Calvin and whoever else, that really has helped me. And so to me, building on what other people have doesn't mean I'm giving it up and I'm turning off my brain. No one ever asked me that, not here, not in this church. And no one asked me that as a scientist either, to take on faith that the Big Bang happened exactly this way, or that any particular equation is 100% right all the time. We just are wrong so much. Sometimes we talk about this cartoon example where you're a two-dimensional creature and you're living on a sphere and you don't know that you're on a sphere and you're walking around and suddenly you're back where you started and you go, wait, I went that way and I came back around here. Just as a thought experiment, that could it be that you could be missing things? How could it not be? I mean, at this point, the scale of things that are happening that are influencing us are so large that it would be kind of foolish to think there aren't influences on us beyond our understanding. I mean, I think most scientists now would acknowledge that there's a lot going on at a minimum. And the idea that there's a study my brain, calculate where I'm at, figure out why I made decisions, figure out who's criminally liable, who's going to go on to succeed, who's going to fail. None of that is clear. Which relationships are trustworthy, which fact from the Bible is precisely accurate. All of those things are going to be challenging for us.
Well, thank you for teaching us. I feel like I've learned quite a bit just listening about Pangea and all the plates moving, just that. Thank you for teaching us some things today and sharing. But I do want to ask one last question. There are people that are struggling to reconcile their faith with science, and they feel that they can't choose one or or they have to choose one or the other. Based on your personal experiences, do you have one thought or resource that you would share that has helped you that you think could possibly help somebody who might be struggling with that?
A couple of them that I think of. Again, I get that people want to live in a simple universe. They want to know there's no God. God, that would be so simple. I mean, it would make it just easier. There you go. I get to do what I want to do. You do what you want to do. Nothing really matters. I make up my own truth. That's just so easy. And a lot of kids, young males in particular, tend to be attracted to that and want the simple story. And then it falls apart and they develop a new understanding. That happened to me, happened to lots of my friends, and I watched them struggle with what it did to them to not have a framework for thinking about anything, how bad it is. We have a suicide epidemic, a drug abuse epidemic at the moment. People just looking for something that makes sense. And so there are real consequences of not having a worldview that makes sense. I totally get that. I don't want to turn my brain off and take somebody else's reality and just believe it wholeheartedly. You don't have to. No one asks you to do that, at least not here. And so I do think that when there's a community of people who've got an understanding, it's much, much better. A lot of my friends who are atheists, and there are a few among the scientists for sure, one of the questions I often ask them is, the most successful way to get over, an addiction problem is a faith-based, sort of 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, which has been modified to lots of things. Why do you need that? Why can't you just stop drinking or using? Why does God have to be involved with this? Why isn't there a self-help book that doesn't have that? There is, it just doesn't work. And so that's one of the examples for me. The last is the idea that it just seems impossible that something so big could love me. That scale of it, you're so far away. How could you be that far away and still care about me? And so I told the middle school youth group when I talked with them last, probably a year ago now, maybe before COVID, I can't remember, about just like miraculous things. There's a gravitational wave observatory, and you can now see, black holes colliding and things going on. And what does that tell you? That there's just so much more out there. And then that's not scary. I think if it wasn't for a faith tradition, it would be scary to wonder who created all this? Where did it all happen? What do they care about me? And it's not scary. And so I think isolation is scary. Making it up is scary. Being overwhelmed and alone is scary. And it's unnecessary. And so for me, I had lots of friends who disconnected from the church when I was a kid, and not all of them are alive today. In part because they just wandered off and tried to figure it all out themselves. And that tragedy for me is helpful in remembering what holds me, what anchors me, what makes sense. And then remembering specific times when I heard God's voice, typically at a church event, and then just thinking, why do I want to ignore this? Why do I want to say it needs to be every day? I need to hear it every day. I need to know now. That's not how it works. I don't get to make those requests that science makes sense or that my faith makes sense. And so I feel confident with that level of understanding.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your perspective, your wisdom, and your knowledge with us. We really appreciate you being here today. And Eric, thank you for the questions, for the thoughts, and you got to have your follow-up science episode.
Thanks for having me. Yep.
Now, for any of the resources that were mentioned during the podcast, we're going to make those available on our website, fumcr.com/morethansunday. And I invite you to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast player or to our FUMCR YouTube channel so you'll be updated on any new videos or contents that the church puts out, in addition to when the next season of More Than Sunday drops. I'd like to thank you all so much for listening or watching, and we hope that you have a great day.